A desperate German shepherd appears out of the darkness, barking wildly at a reclusive old man. But she's not just lost, she's begging him to follow. And when he finally does, he stumbles upon something heartbreaking. Her tiny, injured puppy, barely clinging to life. He rushes them to safety, thinking he's saving them. But what he doesn't know is that they're about to save him too. Because what happens next is nothing short of a miracle. Who left these dogs to him? And how will they lead him to a past he tried to forget, and a future he never saw coming? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The bell above the hardware store door chimed one last time as Jack Harrison pulled it shut. His weathered hands moved through the familiar motions of locking up, muscle memory taking over after decades of the same routine. The streetlights cast long shadows across Main Street, their dim glow barely reaching the edges of the empty sidewalks. Jack's breath formed small clouds in the cold winter air. The evening had settled into that peculiar stillness that came with early darkness, when most of Willow Creek's residents were already home, warm behind lit windows and drawn curtains. His footsteps echoed against the brick buildings as he walked toward his old blue pickup truck. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet, like a disturbance in the natural order of things. A gust of wind rustled through bare tree branches, sending a shiver down his spine. He pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, his mind already on the leftover soup waiting at home. The truck handle was cold under his fingers when a sharp bark cut through the silence. Jack's head snapped up, his heart jumping in his chest. There, emerging from the shadows between buildings, was a German shepherd. Her ribs showed clearly through matted fur, and her golden eyes held a wild, desperate look that made Jack take an instinctive step backward. Before he could react further, the dog lunged forward. Her bark echoed off the buildings, urgent and pleading. Jack barely had time to raise his arms before she grabbed his sleeve between her teeth, pulling with surprising strength. "Hey, let go!" Jack tried to yank his arm away, but the dog held firm. Her eyes locked onto his, and something in them made him pause. This wasn't aggression, it was desperation. The dog whimpered, tugging harder at his sleeve. Her whole body trembled, whether from cold or fear Jack couldn't tell. When he tried to pull away again, she let out a sound that was half bark, half cry. "What the hell do you want?" Jack muttered, the words coming out in a cloud of frozen breath. The dog responded by pulling harder, her paws scrambling against the pavement. Standing there in the cold, Jack felt something crack in his carefully maintained wall of indifference. The dog's eyes held too much intelligence, too much purpose, to be ignored. Against every instinct that told him to get in his truck and drive away, he found himself taking a step in the direction she was pulling. The German shepherd's ears perked up immediately, and she tugged him toward the dark alley between his store and the old bakery. Jack hesitated for just a moment, then followed her into the shadows, leaving the dim safety of the streetlights behind. Jack followed the German shepherd deeper into the alley, his boots scraping against broken concrete. "This is crazy," he muttered, watching the dog's tail disappear around a corner. The smell of rotting garbage made his nose wrinkle. Shadows stretched long and dark across the narrow passage, cast by the single flickering streetlight behind him. The dog stopped suddenly, her golden eyes reflecting what little light reached them. She turned to look at Jack, as if making sure he was still there, then darted behind a stack of wooden crates near the old diner's back door. Jack's feet stopped moving. This was stupid. He should turn around, go home, forget this whole thing. But then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A high-pitched whimper, weak and filled with pain. His heart thumped harder. Following the sound, he stepped closer to the pile of collapsed crates. Some were broken, splintered wood scattered across wet pavement. Jack pushed aside a piece of rotting board, and what he saw made his chest tight. A tiny German Shepherd puppy lay curled into a tight ball, its fur matted and wet. Each shallow breath seemed to take all its strength. Its small body trembled, ribs clearly visible under its skin. Jack's eyes caught the glint of blood. The pup's back leg was swollen, a deep cut running along its side. "Oh, hell," Jack whispered, kneeling down beside the injured animal. His rough hands hovered over the puppy's tiny form, afraid to touch something so fragile. The puppy's eyes were barely open, glazed with pain. Just as Jack carefully slipped his hands under the cold, wet body, he heard a thud beside him. The mother dog had collapsed, her legs giving out from exhaustion. She lay there, her sides heaving with each breath, eyes fixed on her puppy, even though she couldn't move anymore. Jack looked between them, the unconscious mother and her barely breathing pup. The night was getting colder. Without help, they wouldn't survive until morning. He clenched his jaw, knowing what he had to do. Standing up with the puppy cradled against his chest, he bent down and gathered the mother dog in his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, all skin and bones under her dirty fur. Jack straightened up, both dogs in his arms, and turned back toward his truck. Jack staggered toward his truck, the weight of the unconscious German Shepherd heavy in his arms. The puppy, tucked against his chest, felt as light as a feather. Too light. Its tiny body trembled with each shallow breath, barely there movements that made his stomach twist with worry. "Damn it all," he growled, fumbling with the door handle. The street was empty, the only sound his labored breathing and the scrape of his boots on the cold pavement. A bitter wind cut through his jacket, but he barely noticed the chill. He laid the mother dog across the passenger seat as gently as he could, trying not to jostle her limp form. Her matted fur left dark smudges on his coat, and the metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils. From the glove compartment, he pulled out an old shop towel, one he'd meant to throw away months ago, stained with grease and worn thin at the edges. Now his hands moved on their own, carefully wrapping the shivering puppy like it was made of glass. "This isn't your problem, Harrison," he muttered to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Just walk away. Someone else will handle it. Not your responsibility." But even as the thoughts crossed his mind, his body betrayed him. His fingers were already turning the key in the ignition, moving with a certainty that defied his words. The engine roared to life, breaking the night silence with a familiar rumble that seemed too loud in the empty street. "Stupid!" he grumbled, shifting into drive, the gear shift grinding in protest. "Getting mixed up in this mess. Should have just gone home. Should be in bed right now, not playing hero to a couple of strays." The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled away from the curb, casting long shadows on the deserted road. Every rational thought screamed at him to turn around, to drop them off at the shelter, to do anything but get involved, to stay out of it like he'd been doing for years. Instead, he found himself pressing harder on the gas pedal, heading straight for Dr. Eleanor's veterinary clinic on the other side of town. The mother dog hadn't moved since he'd lifted her, and the puppy. His eyes darted to the small bundle, checking for any sign of life. A weak cry pierced the quiet of the cab. Small, pitiful, dying. The sound hit Jack like a physical blow, cracking something open in his chest that he'd kept locked away for years. Something he'd thought was safely buried beneath layers of carefully constructed indifference. His jaw clenched tight enough to hurt, muscles bunching along his temples. Without thinking, he pressed the accelerator down further, the old truck's engine protesting with a whine as he pushed it faster than he had in years. The speedometer needle climbed steadily higher, townhouses and storefronts blurring past his windows. The bell above the clinic door jangled violently as Jack burst in, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The waiting room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sweat trickled down his neck as he cradled the injured animals. Both lay still in his arms, the mother's dead weight making his muscles burn and tremble with exhaustion. "Need help here." His voice echoed through the empty clinic, gruffer than he'd intended. The sound bounced off the stark white walls lined with educational posters about heartworm prevention and proper pet care. A door squeaked open, and Jack's heart stopped, then lurched painfully in his chest. Eleanor Monroe stood in the doorway, frozen mid-step. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and those same green eyes that had haunted him for 40 years widened in shock. A few strands of hair had escaped to frame her face, softening features that were still striking after all this time. Time seemed to stretch between them like a rubber band pulled too tight, loaded with 4 decades of unspoken words. "Jack!" His name fell from her lips in a whisper, her hand gripping the doorframe as if for support. The puppy's weak whimper snapped them both back to reality. Eleanor's expression shifted instantly, professional mask sliding into place as she assessed the situation. Her shoulders straightened, chin lifting with determined focus. "Sarah!" she called out sharply. "Prep exam room 1. Now! Get everything ready!" A young assistant appeared, taking in the scene with wide eyes, her ponytail swinging as she nodded quickly. "What happened?" Eleanor demanded, already moving forward to examine the animals. Her hands were gentle, but sure as they checked the mother's vital signs, fingers pressing expertly along the dog's ribcage. "Found them in an alley," Jack managed, his voice rough with exertion. "The pup's got a bad leg wound. Mother collapsed right after showing me where he was. She was desperate, wouldn't leave without help." Eleanor nodded, all business now. The weight of their shared past hung heavy in the air, but there wasn't time for it, not with lives on the line. Her focused expression reminded him of how she'd looked during college finals, determined to prove herself to the world. "Follow me," she ordered, leading the way to the exam room. "Sarah, I need IV fluids ready for both, and get the warming blankets, and prep the surgical kit just in case." Jack trailed behind her, watching as she moved with practiced efficiency through the familiar routine. She'd always wanted to be a vet, even back then. Had talked about it endlessly during their late-night study sessions. Now here she was, doing exactly what she'd dreamed of, while he'd stayed stuck in place. The exam room was small but well organized, medical equipment gleaming under bright lights that cast no shadows. Charts and medical instruments lined the walls in neat rows. Eleanor gestured to the steel table, her wedding ring notably absent. "Put them here," she instructed, already pulling on latex gloves with practiced movements. "Carefully. Try not to jostle them." Jack laid them down as gently as he could, his arms trembling from the strain. The mother dog didn't stir, but the puppy let out another weak cry that twisted something in his chest. "How long have they been like this?" Eleanor asked, checking the puppy's gums with professional precision. Her fingers moved with the confidence of decades of experience. "Found them maybe 15 minutes ago," Jack replied, stepping back to give her room to work. His boots squeaked against the clean floor. "The mother was conscious then, led me to the pup. Collapsed right after, like she'd used the last of her strength." Eleanor's hands moved swiftly, checking vital signs, examining wounds. Sarah bustled in with supplies, and together they began setting up IV lines with the smooth coordination of a well-practiced team. "They're both severely dehydrated," Eleanor muttered, more to herself than to Jack. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "The puppy's leg needs immediate attention. Sarah, get me." Jack stood in the doorway, unable to move, feeling like an intruder in this sterile space. Eleanor's voice faded to background noise as he watched her work, noting how the years had changed her, yet left her essentially the same. 40 years. 40 years since he'd last seen her. Since he'd let her walk away because he'd been too proud, too afraid. And now here she was, just as capable and determined as she'd always been, fighting to save these two lives he'd dropped in her lap. His heart pounded against his ribs as the reality of the situation hit him full force. Of all the vets in all the towns in Tennessee, he'd had to walk into hers. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Jack sat in the hard plastic chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second feeling like an hour. Every few minutes his eyes would dart to the exam room door, then back to his boots, worn and scuffed from years of work at the hardware store. 3 times he'd stood up to leave. 3 times he'd sat back down, the image of that tiny puppy's fragile body haunting him. He could still feel its weak heartbeat against his palm when he'd found them huddled in that old shed. The antiseptic smell burned his nose, mixing with the lingering scent of wet dog fur and something else, maybe fear, though he'd never admit it. His leg bounced restlessly, fingers drumming against his knee in an uneven rhythm that matched his racing thoughts. The empty waiting room felt too small, too quiet, filled only with the ghosts of his memories and the soft hum of an ancient heating unit in the corner. The last time he'd been here, this place had belonged to old Doc Wilson, with its creaky wooden chairs and faded pictures of happy pets on the walls. Now it was Eleanor's, and just thinking her name made his chest tighten with a familiar ache he'd spent years trying to ignore. The exam room door creaked open. Jack's head snapped up, his heart jumping into his throat, hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Eleanor stepped out, her face drawn with exhaustion, deep lines around her eyes speaking of the hours she'd spent fighting to save these animals. Her scrubs had spots of water on them, and her graying hair was falling loose from its braid, a few strands framing her face. Even after 40 years, the sight of her made something in his chest ache, a pain both old and new. "They're alive," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "The mother is stable, dehydrated and malnourished, but she'll recover with proper care and time." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice, afraid of what might come out if he tried to speak. "The puppy." Eleanor paused, rubbing her temple with fingers that showed signs of fatigue. "He's critical. The next 24 hours will tell us more. That leg wound was infected, and he's severely undernourished. We're doing everything we can." Jack's shoulders slumped. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been holding them, as if his rigid posture could somehow influence the outcome. Eleanor walked to her desk, pulling out a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been waiting there for some time. She stood before him, holding what looked like a folded document, her expression unreadable, but somehow gentle. "There's something else, Jack." She handed him the paper, her fingers trembling slightly against the worn edge. "These dogs, they belong to Margaret Whitmore." The name hit him like a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. Margaret, his mother's best friend, the woman who'd brought him cookies every Sunday for 30 years, even after he'd stopped answering the door. The woman who never gave up on him, even when he'd given up on himself. Jack ... Eleanor's voice grew softer, tender in a way that made his defenses crack. "Margaret left them to you." He stared at the document in his hands, the words swimming before his eyes like fish in troubled waters. His throat felt too tight, his chest too heavy with the weight of unexpected responsibility. "Why the hell would she leave them to me?" The words came out rough, barely above a whisper, scratching against his throat like sandpaper. Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked at him the way she used to, like she could see straight through his walls to the heart he'd tried so hard to hide away. Because she trusted you, Jack. The first rays of morning light crept through the clinic windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Jack's boots squeaked against the tiles as he paced, the legal document crumpled in his grip. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, and his jaw ached from clenching it all night. The clock on the wall ticked away mercilessly, each second feeling like an accusation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, running a hand through his gray hair. The stubble on his chin scratched against his palm. "I run a hardware store, for crying out loud. I don't have time for dogs. I barely have time to eat lunch most days." Eleanor stood behind the counter, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The morning light caught the silver strands in her dark hair, and for a moment Jack was struck by how familiar she still looked after all these years. The same determined set to her jaw, the same quiet strength in her shoulders that had always made him feel both drawn to her and desperate to escape. "Margaret trusted you with them," Eleanor said, her voice steady but tired. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much either. She knew what she was doing. She always did. "Well, she was wrong." Jack waved the paper in the air, his frustration building with each passing second. "This isn't my problem. I'm not taking them. Find someone else." Eleanor's patience finally snapped. She pushed away from the counter, her eyes flashing with the same fire he remembered from years ago. "They don't have anyone else, Jack, and neither do you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his throat tightening around emotions he refused to name. "You don't know anything about my life. I know you're still hiding in that store, pushing everyone away." Eleanor's voice softened, but her words were no less sharp. They cut through his defenses like they always had. "You can't keep running, Jack." He opened his mouth to argue, but Eleanor was already walking past him toward the back room, the scent of her shampoo, something floral and achingly familiar, trailing in her wake. The dismissal was clear. The choice was his to make. Jack's hand shook as he crumpled the paper into his pocket. Without another word, he stormed out of the clinic, letting the door slam behind him with enough force to rattle the glass. The morning air was crisp against his face as he yanked open his truck door and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to ignore the way Eleanor's words echoed in his head. "Not my problem," he muttered, backing out of the parking space. The tires crunched over gravel as he pulled away. But as he drove away from the clinic, something inside him twisted painfully, like a knife being turned in his gut. Margaret's face floated in his mind. Her kind eyes filled with that knowing look she'd always had, and for the first time since reading her will, he wondered if maybe she had known exactly what she was doing after all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic's parking lot as Jack sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel. He'd driven around town for hours, trying to convince himself he wouldn't come back. But here he was, defeated by his own conscience and the memory of Margaret's trust in him. With a heavy sigh, he pushed open the truck door. The cold air bit at his face as he trudged toward the clinic entrance, his boots heavy on the concrete. He'd tell Eleanor to find someone else, someone younger, someone who actually wanted dogs. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Eleanor looked up from her desk, and something in her eyes told him she'd been expecting him. Without a word, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out 2 leather leashes. Jack's jaw tightened. "You're serious?" "You're their only chance, Jack." Eleanor's voice was firm but gentle, like she was talking to a spooked animal. She held out the leashes, waiting. "Damn it," he muttered, but his fingers closed around the worn leather. The material felt foreign in his calloused hands, a physical reminder of the responsibility he was about to take on. A soft clicking of nails on tile drew his attention. Grace emerged from the back room, her golden eyes fixed on him. She moved slowly, cautiously, but there was something in her gaze that made Jack's chest tighten. She didn't fight when he clipped the leash to her collar, just watched him with those knowing eyes. Eleanor appeared with Lucky bundled in a blanket, the puppy's small form barely visible among the folds. "He needs these medications twice a day," she said, handing Jack a paper bag. "And he'll need to come back in 3 days for a checkup." Jack took the bag without argument, too tired to fight anymore. The weight of it felt like chains around his wrists, binding him to a future he'd never wanted. The drive home was quiet, except for Lucky's occasional weak whimpers from the back seat. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her posture alert despite her exhaustion, watching the town pass by through the window. Jack kept glancing at her in his peripheral vision, wondering what Margaret had seen in him that made her think he could do this. His house came into view, a small, weathered structure that hadn't seen any real care since Susan died. He pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, sitting there for a long moment in the silence. Grace turned her head to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made him uncomfortable, like she could see right through his gruff exterior to the lonely man beneath. Jack let out a heavy sigh, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Well," he muttered, reaching for the door handle, "welcome to hell." Jack's boots echoed through his empty farmhouse as he carried the dogs inside. The place hadn't changed in years. Same worn furniture, same faded wallpaper, same layer of dust on everything. The familiar musty scent of disuse hung in the air, mingling with the lingering aroma of his morning coffee, just the way he liked it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. "Don't get comfortable," he muttered, laying down an old blanket near the wood stove. The heat from the dying embers would keep them warm enough. "This isn't permanent." Grace settled onto the blanket, her golden eyes never leaving Jack as she curled protectively around Lucky. Her body tensed slightly whenever he moved, ready to defend her pup if needed. The puppy barely stirred, his tiny body rising and falling with shallow breaths that made Jack's stomach clench with unwanted worry. Jack turned away, heading straight for the cabinet where he kept his whiskey. His hands moved automatically, reaching for the bottle that had been his only companion for too many nights. The familiar burn of alcohol would help him forget how much this whole situation bothered him. But halfway through pouring his drink, a weak whimper made him pause. "Don't you dare die on my watch," he growled, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. Despite his words, his steps were quiet as he approached the makeshift bed. Lucky hadn't moved an inch, looking impossibly small against the dark fabric of the blanket. Jack's weathered hands clenched at his sides, calluses catching against rough skin. "Damn it all!" He knelt down, checking the puppy's breathing. Was it slower than before? The bandage Eleanor had wrapped around Lucky's leg was still clean, but the pup felt cold beneath his tentative touch. Grace watched him intently, her tail giving a slight wag when Jack adjusted the blanket around Lucky. Her eyes held a wisdom that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see right through his gruff exterior. "This doesn't mean anything," Jack told her gruffly, avoiding her knowing gaze. "I just don't want to deal with the paperwork if something happens." The excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He returned to his whiskey, but found himself looking over at the dogs every few minutes. The silence in the house felt different now, less empty, more weighted with responsibility he never wanted. Each tick of the old wall clock seemed to mock his attempts at indifference. A knock at the door made him jump. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Only one person would dare check up on him, would brave his surly attitude on a cold evening like this. Eleanor stood on his porch, medical supplies in hand, her expression a mix of determination and something else, something that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. The porch light caught the silver strands in her hair, reminding him of all the years that had passed between them. "I'm not here to argue, Jack," she said before he could speak, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I'm here to help Lucky." She stepped past him into the house, her presence filling the space in a way that made it hard for him to breathe. The scent of her subtle perfume cut through the staleness of his self-imposed isolation. He closed the door behind her, watching as she knelt beside the dogs. Grace's tail wagged harder at Eleanor's approach, and even Lucky managed a tiny lick when she checked his temperature. The easy trust between them only highlighted his own awkwardness. "I don't need," Jack started, his voice gruffer than intended. "Yes, you do," Eleanor cut him off, not even looking up from her examination. Her tone brooked no argument, reminding him of all the times she'd seen right through his excuses. "Now come here and learn how to change his bandages." The kitchen's dim light cast long shadows across Jack's weathered face as he watched Eleanor move around his space with familiar ease, her movements as natural as if she'd never left. The coffee maker hummed to life, filling the quiet room with its gentle gurgling and the rich scent of brewing coffee. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches, rattling the window panes, and inside, the wood stove crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the worn linoleum floor. "Sit down, Jack," Eleanor said firmly, pulling out a chair with a gentle scrape against the floor. "You look ready to bolt, and we both know you're not going anywhere tonight." He scowled, but complied, his joints creaking as he lowered himself into the wooden chair that had been his constant companion for countless solitary meals. His eyes kept darting between Eleanor and the dogs by the fire, as if unsure which made him more nervous. Grace lifted her head briefly, watching them with tired eyes, before curling closer around Lucky, who snuffled softly in his sleep. Eleanor placed 2 steaming mugs on the table, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air between them like an offering of peace. Her gaze fell on Margaret's letter, still lying where Jack had tossed it earlier, its corners slightly crumpled from his angry grip. "Why me?" Jack's voice was rough, barely above a whisper, heavy with confusion and something that sounded almost like fear. "Of all people, why would Margaret saddle me with this?" Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee, studying him over the rim of her mug, her eyes gentle but searching. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and slightly worn at the edges. Margaret's neat handwriting spelled out Jack on the front in familiar flowing script. "She left this with me," Eleanor said softly, her fingers brushing the paper with reverence. "Asked me to give it to you when the time was right." She placed the envelope on the table between them, like a bridge across years of silence. "I think now's that time." Jack stared at the letter like it might bite him, his shoulders tense with apprehension. "I don't want to know what's in there." "Yes, you do." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of certainty. "Margaret knew you better than anyone, Jack. Even better than—" She stopped herself, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Better than me." The old hurt flickered across her face before she could hide it. "She was a meddling old woman," Jack muttered, but there was no real heat in his words, just a tired sort of fondness. "She was your mother's best friend, and she loved you like a son." Eleanor pushed the letter closer to him, her fingertips lingering on the envelope's edge. "She had her reasons for choosing you. Good ones." Jack's weathered hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope, betraying the emotion he tried so hard to hide. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers, like the last whisper of a dear friend. He turned it over, staring at the sealed flap as if it contained all the answers he'd been avoiding. "Whatever's in there," Eleanor said quietly, her voice soft with understanding. "She believed in you, Jack. She always did." His throat tightened as he slowly broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper loud in the quiet kitchen. Grace's tail thumped once against the floor, as if offering encouragement, the steady rhythm matching the beating of his uncertain heart. The kitchen shadows deepened as Jack stared at the envelope, his coffee growing cold and forgotten in the thick silence. His calloused fingers traced the edge of the paper again and again, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. The wood stove popped and crackled in the corner, marking the heavy silence between him and Eleanor, like a metronome counting out the moments of his hesitation. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of years of understanding. "You owe it to her, Jack." He shot her a hard look, one that would have sent most people backing away, but she didn't flinch. She never had. With a deep breath that seemed to come from his bones, Jack tore open the envelope, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Margaret's familiar handwriting jumped out at him, neat and precise as always, each letter carefully formed just the way she'd written for decades. "Dear Jack," he read silently, his throat tightening with each word. "If you're reading this, then Grace has already found you. She was a gift to me when I needed her most." Jack's hands trembled as he read about Margaret's final years, how Grace had given her purpose, companionship, and joy when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. His chest grew tight as Margaret described watching him after Susan's death, seeing him withdraw from the world brick by brick, until he'd built himself a fortress of solitude. "You're dying inside, Jack." Margaret's words cut straight through him, sharp as winter wind. "Not quickly, but slowly, surely, like a tree rotting from within." He had to pause, his vision blurring as memories of Margaret's knowing smile and gentle wisdom washed over him. Eleanor remained silent across the table, her presence both comforting and unsettling, like a familiar song played in a minor key. "But Grace," Margaret's letter continued, the words seeming to pulse with urgency. "She saved me, Jack, and she will save you too, if you let her. She sees past walls better than any human I've known. Let her in, please." Jack's jaw clenched so tight it hurt, muscles working beneath his weathered skin. His hands shook as he carefully folded the letter, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers as if he could press away the truth in Margaret's words. The weight of her final message pressed down on him like a physical thing, heavy as wet snow on bare branches. "She was wrong," he said, his voice rough as gravel on an old country road. The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, echoing with the emptiness of a lie told too many times. Eleanor watched him carefully, her eyes soft in the dim light, filled with a patience he didn't deserve. Was she? The pale light of dawn crept through Jack's dusty windows, casting long shadows across his living room floor. He stirred on the couch, his back stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. Something felt different. Opening his eyes, he noticed a blanket draped over him, one he definitely hadn't grabbed himself. The worn fabric smelled faintly of lavender, and he had a sneaking suspicion who had left it. "What the?" he muttered, pushing himself up. His joints creaked in protest, reminding him he wasn't as young as he used to be. His eyes drifted to the fireplace, where Lucky lay curled up on the makeshift bed of old blankets. The puppy's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His injured legs stretched out awkwardly, the dried blood still visible on his matted fur. Grace lay beside him, her golden eyes fixed steadily on Jack, watching his every move with an intelligence that made him uncomfortable. Jack ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and the nagging guilt that had settled in his chest overnight. The medical supplies Eleanor had left sat untouched on the coffee table, seeming to mock him. He glanced at Lucky's swollen leg and felt something twist in his gut, something that felt suspiciously like responsibility. "Damn it!" he growled softly, pushing himself off the couch. His knees popped as he crouched beside the injured pup, the morning light highlighting every scrape and bruise on the little creature. Grace's ears perked up, but she didn't move from her protective position. Her gaze remained intense, calculating, like she was trying to decide if he could be trusted with her precious charge. She tilted her head slightly, as if challenging him to prove himself worthy. Jack reached for the antiseptic and clean bandages, his hands hovering uncertainly over Lucky's leg. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, dark and pain-filled, but there was a spark of trust there that made Jack's throat tight. "All right, kid," Jack found himself saying, his gruff voice softening without permission. "Let's get this over with. Your doc's gonna have my hide if I don't take care of you proper." His calloused fingers, more used to fixing leaky pipes than tending wounds, moved with surprising gentleness. He cleaned the cut carefully, remembering Eleanor's instructions from the night before, her voice echoing in his mind with each precise movement. "Easy now," he murmured as Lucky flinched. "Almost done. You're doing good. Real good." Grace inched closer, her nose nearly touching Jack's arm as she supervised his work. He pretended not to notice, but he could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin, her maternal concern evident in every movement. "You're tougher than you look," Jack continued talking, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Surviving out there in that alley. Guess you get that from your mama. She's quite something herself, isn't she?" His fingers worked methodically, cleaning and wrapping the wound. Lucky stayed remarkably still, as if understanding the importance of the moment. The trust in those young eyes made something shift inside Jack's chest, something he thought had long since hardened over. "There," Jack said, securing the bandage. "That should—" Lucky let out a soft whimper and pressed his small head against Jack's hand. Jack froze, his whole body going rigid at the unexpected contact. But as those trusting eyes looked up at him, filled with innocent gratitude, he found he couldn't pull away. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant, like the first crack in a wall of ice. Sunlight streamed through Jack's kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He stood at the counter, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee, his movements slow and tired. The familiar scent of coffee grounds filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in memories he usually kept locked away. The morning felt heavy with something he couldn't quite name, weighing on his shoulders like an invisible burden. A knock echoed through the quiet house. Jack didn't need to look to know who it was. Eleanor's distinctive three-tap pattern hadn't changed in 40 years. Some things, he thought wryly, were as constant as the sunrise. She walked in before he could answer, arms full of supplies. Her eyes swept over his rumpled clothes and the dark circles under his eyes, and a knowing smirk tugged at her lips. "You look like a man who didn't sleep." The morning light caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shimmer like strands of starlight. "Didn't ask for your opinion," Jack muttered, but there was no real bite to his words. His fingers tightened around his empty coffee mug, seeking anchor in its familiar weight. Eleanor moved around his kitchen with familiar ease, setting down bandages and dog food on the counter. She knew where everything was, just like she always had. Jack couldn't help but notice the graceful way she moved, how she still commanded any space she entered. Every gesture was purposeful, efficient, yet somehow elegant in its simplicity. "The puppy kept you up?" she asked, sorting through the supplies. Her hands moved with practiced precision, arranging everything just so. "Something like that." Jack leaned against the counter, watching her. The morning light caught her silver hair, and for a moment, he saw the young woman who used to laugh at his stubbornness. Time had changed them both, but somehow she'd grown more beautiful with age, like a well-loved book whose pages had softened with handling. "You always were terrible at asking for help," Eleanor said softly. And suddenly, they weren't talking about the dogs anymore. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of unspoken feelings. Jack's jaw tightened. "That what you think? That I needed help?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scratchy with defensive pride. "You needed something." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "But you never fought for it. For me." Her words carried the weight of old wounds that had never quite healed. "You walked away first," Jack shot back, old pain making his voice rough. His hands gripped the counter edge until his knuckles turned white. "Because you gave me no choice." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. "You pushed and pushed until walking away was the only option left." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the emotion she usually kept so carefully controlled. The kitchen felt too small, too full of things they'd never said. Jack turned away, staring out the window, pretending his heart wasn't pounding in his chest. The morning sun seemed to mock him with its cheerful brightness. A heavy sigh broke the tension. "I came to check on the dogs," Eleanor said quietly. "Not to relive history." Her voice had softened, but the hurt lingered underneath like a bruise. Jack watched as she knelt beside Lucky, her hands gentle as she examined the puppy's injured leg. Her touch was sure and careful, just like it had always been. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to wonder, what if he had fought harder back then? What if he hadn't let his fear win? The questions haunted him like ghosts in the morning light. Lucky whimpered softly under Eleanor's touch, and the moment shattered like glass. The present rushed back in, leaving the weight of their shared past hanging in the air between them. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through Jack's living room windows, mixing with the gentle heat from the crackling fireplace. Lucky lay on his makeshift bed, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath. The room smelled of antiseptic and wood smoke, a strange combination that somehow suited the moment perfectly. Eleanor knelt beside Lucky, her movements careful and precise as she unwrapped his bandages. Her practiced hands moved with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. "Watch closely, Jack. You'll need to do this twice a day, morning and evening." Jack crossed his arms, leaning against the wall with his typical stubborn stance. "I know how to clean a wound. Been doing it long enough." "Really?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a challenge dancing in her eyes. "Show me then. Let's see what you've got." Muttering under his breath about bossy vets, Jack knelt beside her. His calloused hands looked too rough for such delicate work, but he surprised himself by being gentle as he cleaned around the cut, taking extra care not to cause any discomfort. "Not bad," Eleanor admitted, watching his technique with professional interest. "Now wrap it like this." She demonstrated the proper technique, her fingers brushing against Jack's as she guided him. The brief contact sent a familiar warmth through both of them, though neither acknowledged it. Grace watched from her spot nearby, her golden eyes fixed on Jack's every move. Her protective instincts were evident in her alert posture, but her tail thumped softly against the floor when he finished the bandaging without hurting Lucky. "There," Jack grumbled, trying to mask his satisfaction with irritation. "Happy now?" Before Eleanor could answer, Lucky stirred. The puppy's legs twitched, and he lifted his head, blinking at them with drowsy determination. Then slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up on shaky legs. Eleanor's breath caught. "Jack, look!" Her voice was barely above a whisper, not wanting to break the moment. Lucky wobbled, his injured leg trembling as he tested his weight on it. The puppy's determination showed in his furrowed brow and concentrated expression, his tiny pink tongue peeking out with effort. Jack's hands clenched at his sides. He tried to keep his face neutral, but his eyes never left Lucky as the pup took one shaky step forward. Despite his attempts at indifference, concern, and hope warred clearly in his expression. Grace let out a low, approving whine, her tail wagging faster now. She inched closer, ready to support her puppy if needed. Lucky managed another wobbly step before sitting down, clearly tired but proud of himself. His tiny tail wagged with triumph, and he looked up at Jack as if seeking approval, his brown eyes bright with trust. "Tough little bastard, huh?" Jack muttered, his voice gruffer than usual, betraying the emotion he was trying to hide. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with understanding, seeing right through his gruff exterior to the softening heart beneath. "Takes after you." The evening settled over Jack's farmhouse like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a chill that made Eleanor wrap her hands tighter around her coffee mug. They sat on wooden chairs on his front porch, the old boards creaking beneath them. Inside, they could hear Grace's occasional movement as she tended to Lucky. The coffee's steam curled up into the darkening sky. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with 40 years of things left unsaid. Eleanor took a slow sip, then set her mug down with purpose. "Are you going to keep them?" Jack's weathered hands gripped his own mug harder, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight were fading into purple-black darkness. "You care about them, Jack." Eleanor's voice was soft but firm. "You're just afraid to admit it." His jaw clenched, the muscle twitching slightly. The same stubborn expression she remembered from decades ago, when he'd let her walk away without a fight. Eleanor stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden boards. She shook her head, and there was something final in the gesture. "It's too late, isn't it?" Jack turned toward her then, and something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. But whatever it was, he buried it quickly, like he always did. Eleanor waited a moment longer, hoping for something. Words, a gesture, anything. But Jack remained silent, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. "It's too late, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely carrying in the evening air. Jack watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller against the darkness. Something heavy settled in his chest, sinking deeper with each step she took, until she disappeared entirely into the night. The dying embers in the fireplace cast long shadows across Jack's living room. He dozed fitfully on the couch, his body tense even in sleep. Something wasn't right. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding without knowing why. A soft whimper drew his attention to Lucky's bed near the fireplace. Grace paced back and forth, her nails clicking against the wooden floor. Her ears were flat against her head, and she kept looking between Jack and her puppy. "What's wrong, girl?" Jack's voice was rough with sleep as he pushed himself up from the couch. The moment his hand touched Lucky's small body, his stomach dropped. The puppy was burning up, his tiny chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "Damn it, kid, don't do this." Jack's fingers trembled as he gently shook Lucky, trying to get a response. The puppy's eyes barely opened, glazed and unfocused. His usual wiggle was gone, replaced by a frightening stillness. Grace whined louder, pressing her nose against Lucky's side. Her golden eyes met Jack's, filled with a mother's desperate worry. Jack's throat tightened. Without thinking, he scooped Lucky up, cradling him against his chest. The puppy felt like a furnace, his small body radiating heat through the blanket. "Come on, Grace," he called, already moving toward the door. She followed close behind, her tail low and tense. Jack's boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he rushed to his truck. His hand shook as he opened the door, carefully placing Lucky on the seat. Grace jumped in after them, hovering over her puppy protectively. The engine roared to life, and Jack threw the truck into reverse. His knuckles went white as he gripped the steering wheel, speeding down the empty streets of Willow Creek. "Hold on, kid," he muttered, his voice catching. "Just hold on." The first rays of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when Jack's truck screeched to a halt outside Eleanor's clinic. His hand shook as he cradled Lucky's limp body against his chest, the puppy's breathing shallow and labored. Grace whimpered from the truck, watching through the window with anxious eyes. Jack pounded on the glass door, his voice hoarse. "Eleanor! Eleanor, wake up!" The darkness inside the clinic shifted, and Eleanor appeared, hair disheveled, wearing a wrinkled sweater over her pajamas. Her eyes widened at Jack's expression, and she quickly unlocked the door. "He won't wake up," Jack's voice cracked. "His fever's getting worse." Eleanor took Lucky from Jack's arms, her practiced hands already checking vital signs. "Follow me," she ordered, hurrying to the exam room. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Lucky looked even worse. His tiny chest barely moved, and his fur was damp with fever sweat. Eleanor's movements were swift and precise as she checked his temperature, listened to his heart, and examined the wound on his leg. Jack paced the small room, 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. His boots squeaked against the linoleum floor. "Fix him," he demanded, but it sounded more like a plea. Eleanor's face grew darker as she continued her examination. She pressed her lips together, a gesture Jack remembered from 40 years ago. It meant bad news was coming. "The infection has spread," she said quietly. "It's worse than I thought. He needs specialized treatment, Jack. There's a clinic in Nashville that could help, but—" She hesitated, meeting his eyes. "The treatment is experimental. It's expensive." "How much?" Jack's voice was rough. Eleanor told him the number. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. "That's more than I make in 3 months, he whispered. "I know." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "But without it—" Jack turned away, his hands clenching into fists. The weight of it crushed him. He'd finally let himself care about something, finally opened his heart just a crack, and now— "There has to be something else," he growled. But Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Lucky lay motionless on the exam table, his small body looking more fragile with each passing second. Jack stared at him, remembering how the pup had pressed against his hand just yesterday, how he'd taken those first shaky steps. The rage built inside him, hot and helpless. Without a word, he stormed out of the clinic, letting the door slam behind him. In the empty parking lot, he reached his truck and slammed his fists against the cold metal, screaming into the darkness. His voice echoed across the empty street, raw with pain and fury at his own powerlessness. Jack's truck sat motionless in the dark, a cold metal shell against the pre-dawn silence. Inside, his breath came in ragged bursts, fogging up the windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white, but he couldn't make himself let go. The helplessness crushed his chest like a physical weight. He recognized this feeling, this terrible, suffocating sensation of watching someone slip away while being completely powerless to stop it. It was the same feeling that had brought him to his knees 15 years ago, watching Susan fade away in that sterile hospital room. Damn it, he whispered, his voice cracking. Damn it all. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the cold leather against his skin. His shoulders shook with emotions he'd kept buried for so long they felt foreign now. The thought of losing Lucky, this tiny scrap of life he'd only known for days, ripped open wounds he thought had long since scarred over. Movement caught his eye, and he lifted his head. Through the darkness, he could see Grace's silhouette in the window. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. Just waiting. The sight of her made his throat tighten. She trusted him to save her pup, and he was failing her. Jack closed his eyes, his chest heaving with a deep breath. Then, surprising himself, he did something he hadn't done since Susan's last night. He prayed. It wasn't an elegant prayer. It wasn't even really a proper prayer. Just broken whispers in the darkness of his truck cab. I know I haven't talked to you in a long time, he muttered, his voice rough. And I'm not asking for myself. I don't deserve. Just ... He swallowed hard. That pup in there, he's fighting. He's fighting so hard. Don't. His voice cracked. Don't take him too. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost alive. Jack opened his eyes, looking at Grace's unwavering silhouette in the window. She hadn't moved an inch, still watching, still waiting for him to do something, anything, to help her baby. Jack roughly wiped his face with the back of his hand, feeling the wetness there. His throat felt raw as he whispered, "If you're listening, don't do this to me again." Jack stared at his untouched coffee, watching steam rise in lazy spirals. The morning sun filtered through his kitchen window, but he barely noticed. His mind kept circling back to Lucky, lying weak and feverish at Eleanor's clinic. The weight of helplessness pressed down on his shoulders, making even breathing feel like work. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws. Every now and then she'd let out a soft whine, as if sharing his worry. Jack reached down absently to scratch behind her ears. "I know, girl," he muttered. "I know." The sharp ring of the phone shattered the morning quiet. Jack jumped, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen, and his heart clenched. "Eleanor." His voice came out rough, preparing for the worst. "Jack!" The urgency in her tone made him grip the counter. But there was something else there, something that made him pause. "Jack, listen to me. I've been making calls all night." He held his breath, afraid to hope. "There's a research center in Nashville," she continued, words tumbling out quickly. "They're doing a study on innovative treatments for injured animals. I sent them Lucky's case. And Jack, they want to help. They'll cover everything. The treatment, the care, all of it." The room seemed to tilt. Jack's legs felt weak, and he sank into a kitchen chair. "What?" "They'll do it for free, Jack. All of it." Eleanor's voice softened. "Lucky has a chance." Jack opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat felt too tight, too full of emotions he couldn't name. Grace lifted her head, watching him intently. "Jack?" Eleanor's voice gentled even more. "Are you there?" He managed a grunt, his free hand pressing against his eyes. "This isn't just about Lucky," she said quietly. "Jack, this is your second chance at everything." He sat there, phone pressed to his ear, feeling something crack inside his chest. Grace stood up and placed her head on his knee, her eyes fixed on his face. Without thinking, he reached out to touch her fur, anchoring himself in the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, I know," She cut him off, understanding in her tone. "I know, Jack." After hanging up, Jack sat in his kitchen, letting out a shaky exhale. He looked down at Grace, then up at the ceiling. A half smile tugged at his lips as he muttered, "Maybe someone was listening after all." The truck rumbled down the highway, each mile marked by Jack's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. Lucky lay bundled in blankets on the passenger seat, his tiny body rising and falling with shallow breaths. Grace hadn't moved from her spot beside him, her warm body pressed against his, as if sharing her strength. Eleanor sat in the middle, her shoulder occasionally brushing against Jack's. She noticed how his eyes darted to Lucky every few seconds, how his jaw clenched at each weak whimper that escaped the pup. "He's holding on," Eleanor said softly, but Jack just grunted, pressing down harder on the gas pedal. The specialist clinic appeared ahead, a modern building with glass doors and pristine white walls. Jack pulled into a parking spot, his hands trembling slightly as he cut the engine. Before he could move, a team in blue scrubs rushed out with a gurney. They worked quickly, efficiently, lifting Lucky from his nest of blankets. Grace whined, trying to follow, but Eleanor held her back gently. "We'll take good care of him," one of the nurses assured them, but Jack barely heard. His eyes were fixed on Lucky's small form as they wheeled him through the automatic doors. Jack stood frozen in the parking lot, watching until the doors slid shut behind them. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. The words came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Come on, kid. Fight." The waiting room chairs creaked under Jack's weight as he shifted for the 100th time. The setting sun painted long shadows across the sterile floor, and the quiet hum of medical equipment filled the heavy silence. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but Jack could feel her stealing glances at him every few minutes. His mind wandered to the morning's drive, to Lucky's weak breathing against his leg. The memory made his chest tight. He'd spent decades building walls to keep everyone out. And now here he was, coming undone over a puppy he'd known for less than a week. The sound of footsteps made Jack's head snap up. The veterinarian approached, pulling off his blue latex gloves. Jack was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, his heart hammering against his ribs. The doctor's face was serious, professional, but there was something else there, something that made Jack's breath catch. "Mr. Harrison," the vet began, "Lucky made it through the surgery." The words hit Jack like a physical force. He dropped back into his chair, his legs suddenly weak. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it almost hurt. "The infection was severe," the doctor continued, "but we managed to clear it completely. He fought hard, harder than we expected for a puppy in his condition." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. Beside him, Eleanor reached over and squeezed his arm gently. He didn't pull away. "He'll need time to recover," the vet explained, "but he's stable now. The worst is behind him." Jack cleared his throat, forcing the words past the tightness. "Yeah, he's a fighter." Eleanor watched him carefully, and he could see in her eyes that she understood exactly what this moment meant. How much had changed since that cold night when a desperate dog had grabbed his sleeve. Running a hand over his face, Jack stood again. His voice was rough but steady when he asked, "When can I take him home?" The vet's lips curved into a small smile. "Soon." Jack's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he stared at the clinic's entrance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, but he barely noticed. His mind was too busy wrestling with emotions he thought he'd buried years ago. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her ears perked forward, tail thumping against the leather. She knew. She always seemed to know. "All right," Jack muttered, more to himself than to Grace. "Let's do this." The clinic's automatic doors whooshed open, bringing with them the familiar smell of antiseptic and pet food. A young nurse greeted them with a warm smile, already reaching for her key card to unlock the back area. "He's been asking for you," she said, leading them down the hallway. Well, in his own way. Jack's throat tightened, but he kept his face neutral. The nurse pushed open a door, and there he was, Lucky, small and bandaged, but alive. The puppy's head lifted at the sound of their entrance, his tail giving a weak wag. Grace didn't wait. She bounded forward, her whole body vibrating with nervous energy as she approached her pup. Her nose touched Lucky's gently, checking him over with the thoroughness only a mother could manage. Jack stood frozen in the doorway. The relief hitting him was so intense it almost hurt. His chest felt too tight, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He'd almost lost this little guy, this stubborn fighting pup who'd somehow wormed his way past every wall Jack had built. "It's okay," Eleanor's voice came softly from behind him. He hadn't even heard her approach. "You can go to him." Jack swallowed hard and moved forward, his movements stiff and uncertain. He knelt beside the blanket where Lucky lay, his rough hand hovering for a moment before gently stroking the puppy's fur. Lucky leaned into his touch, letting out a small whimper that seemed to say, "What took you so long?" "Hey, kid," Jack's voice was gruff, barely above a whisper. "You gave us quite a scare there." From the doorway, Eleanor watched silently. She saw the way Jack's shoulders had lost their rigid set, how his hand trembled slightly as it moved over Lucky's fur. The man who'd stormed into her clinic that first night, angry at the world and determined to stay that way, was gone. In his place was someone who'd remembered how to care, how to love, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Grace settled beside Lucky, her body curled protectively around him. Her eyes met Jack's, and there was understanding there. They were in this together now, whether Jack had planned it or not. Lucky's tail thumped weakly against the blanket as Jack continued to pet him. The puppy's eyes were heavy with medication, but they stayed fixed on Jack's face, full of trust that hadn't been there before. Jack cleared his throat, trying to dislodge the emotion stuck there. He looked at Lucky, at Grace, and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his relief. They were his now, his responsibility, his family, as unexpected as that might be. "All right, kid," he said softly, patting Lucky's head. "Let's get you home." The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Jack's farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Lucky lay curled up in his new bed beside the fireplace, his chest rising and falling steadily. Grace sat nearby, her watchful eyes never leaving her pup. Jack sat at his kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. Eleanor sat across from him, her own cup untouched. The silence between them felt heavy with decades of unspoken words. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each moment that passed. Jack's shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. Every now and then, his eyes would flick to Eleanor's face before dropping back to his coffee. Eleanor watched him, patient and still. She'd always been able to read him, even when he tried his hardest to be unreadable. Now, she could see the internal battle playing across his features. Finally, she broke the silence. "You don't have to say it, Jack." Her voice was soft, gentle. "I already know." Jack's head lifted slowly. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in 40 years, he didn't try to hide what was there. The raw vulnerability in his gaze spoke volumes. All the regret, all the longing, all the words he'd never been able to say. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the mug. The afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting the years that had passed between them. "I never stopped caring about you, Ellie," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Jack stared at their joined hands for a long moment, but he didn't pull away. The winter night wrapped around Jack's farmhouse like a cool blanket, stars twinkling above in the clear Tennessee sky. Jack and Eleanor stepped onto the wooden porch, their breath visible in small clouds as they settled into the old rocking chairs. The coffee mugs in their hands offered warmth against the chill. "Remember that summer fair?" Eleanor asked, a smile playing at her lips. "When you won me that ridiculous stuffed bear?" Jack's mouth twitched. "Spent $20 trying to knock down those rigged bottles." "But you wouldn't give up." Eleanor's voice softened. "You were always stubborn like that." "Except when it mattered most," Jack admitted, his voice rough with regret. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared history. The porch boards creaked beneath their chairs, a familiar sound that took them both back decades. "I miss this," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes fixed on the starlit sky. Jack turned to look at her, really look at her. The years had been kind to Eleanor. She was still beautiful, still carried herself with that quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. His heart thumped heavily in his chest. "I was scared to lose you back then," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. His hands tightened around his coffee mug. "I'm still scared now." Eleanor set her mug down and stood up, taking a step toward him. Her eyes were warm, understanding, patient. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jack stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. For a moment, he just looked at her, remembering every reason he'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. Then, before his fear could stop him, he leaned in and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, hesitant at first, like testing waters he hadn't dared wade into for 40 years. But it felt right, felt like coming home after being lost for too long. When they finally pulled apart, Jack rested his forehead against hers, letting out a shaky breath. Eleanor's lips curved into a smile. "Took you long enough." The morning sun painted golden streaks across Jack's worn hardwood floors, warming the house in a way that went deeper than temperature. By the fireplace, Lucky and Grace slept soundly, their bodies curled together in perfect contentment. Lucky's bandaged leg was healing well, and his breathing was strong and steady. A far cry from those desperate nights when Jack wasn't sure the pup would make it. Jack sat at his kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug. The house felt different now. The emptiness that had haunted these rooms for so long had been replaced by something else, something alive and warm. The soft padding of feet made him look up. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her silver hair slightly mussed from sleep, wearing one of his old flannel shirts. Her eyes were soft with understanding as she watched him, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Morning," she said quietly, moving to pour herself some coffee. Jack's chest tightened with an unfamiliar feeling. Not grief or loneliness, the emotions he'd grown so used to, but something lighter, something that felt like hope. Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, their knees touching under the table. The simple contact sent warmth through his entire body. He watched her blow gently on her coffee, the morning light catching the silver in her hair, and realized how right this felt. How natural. Grace lifted her head from her spot by the fire, watching them with those intelligent eyes of hers. She seemed satisfied with what she saw, letting out a contented sigh before settling back down next to Lucky. Jack found himself smiling, actually smiling, as he looked around his kitchen. The house that had felt like a tomb for so long now felt like home. The silence that used to suffocate him was now comfortable, filled with the soft breathing of the dogs and the quiet clink of Eleanor's spoon against her coffee cup. He wasn't alone anymore. The thought struck him suddenly, and instead of frightening him, it filled him with peace. He had a family again, unexpected and unconventional, but real. A woman who had always understood him, even when he couldn't understand himself. 2 dogs who had taught him how to care again when he thought that part of him was dead. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her touch familiar and new all at once. Jack exhaled deeply, feeling decades of pain and loneliness finally begin to fade. For the first time in years, a genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He was home, he was whole, and he wasn't alone anymore. The rain fell softly now, pattering against the leaves overhead as Jack made his way through the darkened woods. His boots squelched in the mud, each step heavy with exhaustion. Inside his jacket, pressed close to his chest, the tiny puppy shivered but stayed quiet. Grace padded alongside him, her wet fur gleaming in what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Every few steps she would bump her nose against his leg, as if making sure he was still steady on his feet. "I'm all right, girl," Jack muttered, his voice rough from the night's ordeal. "We're almost there." His arms ached from carrying the pup, but he didn't dare loosen his hold. The little thing had been through enough already, abandoned in these woods on such a bitter night. Jack's jaw tightened at the thought. Time was when he might have walked away, told himself it wasn't his problem. But that was before Grace and Lucky had changed everything. Through the trees, headlights cut through the darkness. Jack's heart lifted at the sight. Eleanor's truck sat idling at the forest's edge, right where she said she'd be. As he emerged from the tree line, Eleanor jumped out of the driver's seat and rushed toward him. Her eyes went wide when she saw the tiny bundle tucked against his chest. "Jack," she breathed, reaching out as he carefully transferred the puppy into her waiting arms. "Guess we've got another one," he said simply, watching as she cradled the shivering creature. Eleanor looked from the puppy to Jack, her expression softening into something that made his chest tight. It wasn't quite a smile, but it held all the warmth of one, a look that spoke of deep affection and understanding. She saw right through him, just like she always had. Jack let out a long breath, feeling the tension of the night finally leaving his shoulders. The rain had nearly stopped now, just a gentle mist remaining in the air. Without a word, Eleanor reached out and took his free hand in hers. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. This time, he didn't pull away. Instead, he held on tight, knowing he'd never let go again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches across Jack's farmhouse floors. The gentle click of dog paws on wood and occasional soft barks filled the once silent rooms with life. Jack blinked awake, the rich aroma of coffee pulling him from sleep. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a home that was no longer empty. The clink of pots and pans drifted from the kitchen, accompanied by Eleanor's quiet humming, a sound he hadn't heard in 40 years, but somehow never forgot. He padded down the hallway, stopping at the kitchen doorway. Eleanor moved with easy grace, flipping pancakes and stirring eggs like she'd done it there 1,000 times before. By the fireplace, Grace and Lucky were curled together, Lucky's bandaged leg tucked carefully beneath him. The new puppy, Charlie, was nestled against Grace's belly, already looking stronger than the night before. Jack's chest tightened at the sight. Just weeks ago, his house had been as empty as his life. Now, watching Eleanor reach for coffee mugs she somehow knew exactly where to find, he felt something he'd forgotten existed. Belonging. Eleanor turned, catching him watching her. A knowing smirk played at her lips. "Are you going to stand there all day?" or are you going to have breakfast? The morning light caught in her silver-streaked hair, and Jack remembered why he'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. She was still that same fierce, beautiful woman who'd challenged him, pushed him, seen right through his walls. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, pressing a kiss to her temple. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Stay." Eleanor stilled, the spatula hovering above the pancakes. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. This time, there was no hesitation in her voice. "Okay." The word was simple, but it filled every empty space in the room, in his heart. Eleanor reached up, pulling Jack down for a real kiss, soft and sure and full of promise. When they parted, Jack looked around at his transformed home, at the dog sleeping peacefully by the fire, at Eleanor fitting so perfectly into his kitchen, at the morning light warming it all, and finally let himself believe that he wasn't alone anymore. The spring morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and new beginnings. Jack hammered the final nail into the wooden fence post, stepping back to admire his work. The newly enclosed yard stretched before him, a testament to permanence, to staying put. Eleanor squeezed his hand as they watched Lucky and Charlie tumble through the grass, their playful barks echoing across the property. Grace sat alert nearby, her watchful eyes never leaving her charges, even though they were both healthy and strong now. "Never thought I'd see Jack Harrison building a fence," Eleanor teased, bumping his shoulder with hers. "Looks like someone's finally settling down." Jack's low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Guess these mutts needed a proper yard." But his eyes, softer now than they'd been in years, told a different story. This wasn't just about the dogs. It was about building something lasting, something real. Lucky bounded over, his once injured leg now strong and sure. Charlie followed, still slightly clumsy, but full of life. Grace trotted behind them, ever the protective mother. Jack reached down to scratch behind her ears, earning a gentle nudge against his palm. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "this place hasn't felt like just a house in a while." Jack looked around, at the fence he'd built with his own hands, at the dogs that had crashed into his life and refused to leave, at Eleanor standing beside him. Everything he'd been running from, everything he'd been afraid to want, was right here. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, his voice low but sure. "Let's go home." As they stepped onto the porch, the dogs trailing behind them, Jack felt something settle in his chest. For the first time since Susan died, he was no longer alone. If you enjoyed the story of Jack, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.